Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're so happy to have you here. I saw that in the chat, I saw there are some people who are from the Maryland area, New York and Virginia and other places. I also saw somebody who's in Japan and somebody who's in New Zealand. So wherever you are around the world, welcome. It's really wonderful to have you here. My name is Elisa Sperling. I'm the director of HerTorah, and I just want to tell you a couple things about HerTorah. At HerTorah, we strive to create a learning community in which Jewish women from all different backgrounds, ages, denominations, and perspectives can come together and learn with and from one another. We believe that when people learn Torah together, they engage in really deep conversation about the most important subjects, and that each person's experiences and perspectives can teach us so much, things that we wouldn't know on our own. At HerTorah, differences between people are not obstacles. They are ways to enrich our thoughts and help us see things we never could have envisioned on our own. HerTorah has been meeting for 2.5 years now, at first in person in the DC area, and then for some reason we decided to just jump online. We hope that you will sign up to receive our emails and join us at our upcoming sessions. Over the next few months, HerTorah is going to be exploring the theme of women and Torah. So what does it mean when women write Torah commentaries? What does it mean when women, as tonight, actually write Torah scrolls? We are going to be exploring what that means, how Jewish women's voices can enrich our tradition and the ways that we think about Torah and about life. We started before Hanukkah with a session with Michal Lemberger, the author of After Abel, Torah stories told from the perspective of female, usually minor characters. Some of our future sessions will include a session about Megillat Esther, the book of Esther, thinking about Esther and Me Too and how we can relate to the book in the shadow of everything we know about Me Too and about women and sexual violence. Before Pesach, we hope to come together and give you material so that you can bring women's voices to your seders. So that in fact, if you wanted to, your entire Seder could be made up of women's commentaries. And our next session is going to be celebrating the Yortzeit, the day of death of Sarah Schneer, who was a pioneer of women's Torah study. So we hope that you'll come and join us for all of those things. Tonight, I am delighted that we have 3 incredibly talented sofrot, Jewish scribal artists. So I'm going to stop for a second and say, sofer, soferet, sofrim, sofrot, safrut, right? Basically, all of those root words. Sofer means that a person is a scribal artist. Some of them are in the singular, some of them are in the plural, some of them are masculine, some of them are feminine, but basically when you hear that, you can just translate in your head scribal artist. Some of us, I would dare say many of us, have had the experience of building a relationship with Torah by learning Torah, by studying Torah. But what does it mean to have a relationship with Torah built by sitting and actually writing a Torah scroll? Even though that seems pretty esoteric, it's actually a mitzvah for every person, every Jewish person, to write their own Torah scroll. Our 3 outstanding teachers tonight will let us into the world of Safrut. Remember, sofer, soferet, Safrut. Jewish scribal arts, and let us peek into a whole new way to develop a relationship with Torah. A few thank yous first. First of all, thank you, Ariella, who is the dreamer and visionary and incredibly busy person behind all of this. And thank you to Amanda and to my Ziza. Thank you to those who believe in our work and fund us, especially to the Aviv Foundation and to the Covenant Foundation, who gave us the grant, and this is really our last session through the Covenant grant. I want to extend a special thank you to Bria Kahana, who is a soferet, a rabbinical student at Yeshivat Maharat, an artist and an activist, who met with me when I had no idea what I was doing. I just said, I really think that we should have a session on women's sofrot, and she sat with me and walked me through everything and told me about these wonderful sofrot. And of course, thank you to Julie, to Shoshana, and to Rabbi Yonah. We're so happy to have you with us. Okay, I think that's the end of my intro. Okay, now I get to introduce Julie Seltzer. Julie Seltzer is a scribe and Jewish educator with a background in theater arts. She has been writing Torah scrolls since 2009, when she was scribe in residence at the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco, California. Julie is currently at work on her 4th Torah scroll and is writing a memoir that chronicles her spiritual journey. She runs interactive educational workshops locally and nationally, offering a hands-on glimpse into the world of Torah scrolls. Julie resides in the Hudson Valley, New York, with her Israeli mutt, Shusha. Am I saying that right? Shusha? Okay. Her hand, if you open up the Sefaria website and you see a hand writing Torah, that is Julie's hand writing Torah on the Sefaria website. Julie tonight will open for us and will be teaching us about the scribe's toolbox and letting us in behind the scenes of what it means to be a soferet. Thanks so much, Julie.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you, Rabbi Eliza and Ariella and Willa and everyone else who is behind the scenes to make this evening happen and for inviting us. I'm so excited to be here with my colleagues Shoshana and Rabbi Yonah, and also a few other colleagues who are on this call. So hello, and of course to everyone who joined tonight. Thank you for being interested. So I started learning, I'm joining from Beacon, New York, the Hudson Valley. I'm just gonna start my timer because we have 15 minutes, in New York. And I started learning the scribal arts back in the winter of 2008. So I've been at it about 14 years now. And actually Shoshana is one of the very first people I learned with in the summer of 2008. So, and Rabbi Yonah, I hope to meet you in person one day. So I'm going to introduce you to the scribe's toolbox, and through an introduction to our tools, I'm hoping that you'll learn a little bit about the process of scribing. I will try to glance at the chat box as I'm going. So if you have a question that pertains to the immediate thing that I'm talking about, please feel free to throw it in there and I will try to answer it. Alrighty, I'm gonna change my camera here. Okay. So the first thing that I wanted to show you is a sofer's tikkun. This is an example of what we're copying from. So a Torah cannot actually be written from memory. It's not permitted, even if I happen to know the whole Torah by heart, which I definitely do not. And so all Torahs are copied from an extant scroll. The medieval commentator Ramban, Nachmanides, actually has an interesting theory about the very first Torah scroll. He says Moses must have copied from an existing scroll because clearly Moses was following the halacha as the first scribe and of course as Moses, meaning there must have been a first Torah before the first Torah, but I digress. These days, we have the convenience of a scanned and printed copy of someone's handwritten scroll that can sit very nicely and unobtrusively on our writing tables. Everything that we do must be done with kavanah. I'm going to point here. This at the top says L'shem Kiddushat Sefer Torah, which means for the sake of the sanctity of the Torah. And before we start a project, whether it's a Torah, a mezuzah, a Megillah, we say out loud that we're writing this with the intention of the kedusha, of the sanctity of the thing that we're writing. And this is done out loud, and it's something that, you know, of course, has to be in our minds also. And this is just a reminder, in case you forgot, that you're doing this for the sake of the sanctity of the Torah. But hopefully, of course, we do not forget. Now, the side notes here these letters and numbers, these are little hints that help the scribe out to know how much to squish the letters and how much to extend the letters, because the columns are aligned. And as you probably know, you can't have half of a word and then with a dash and then the rest of the word on the next line. So a word needs to fit evenly in that column. So am I squishing or am I extending? Score lines are actually drawn horizontally and vertically in the scroll. The horizontal ones help keep the scribe writing straight. This is an awl, which is a sharp metal tool, and this is what creates the score lines. I've heard of people using the thorn of a rose, but I suspect that these days most people use this this tool, though I'm not totally sure. There are in the Torah, there are 10 different names of God. I'm going to go back to the Tikkun for just a moment. And names of God actually get special intention before they're written and special verbal intention as well. If you see in this particular Tikkun, you see the red highlighted names, those are names of God. And that helps us to be aware, am I about to write a name of God? The 4-letter name of God, the Tetragrammaton, is always a name of God, whereas the word Elohim could mean God. It could also mean gods, as in Elohim Acherim, other gods, which would not be given the special intention for God's name because it's not God's name. Now, if you're wondering what the pink is, that means it's a case of doubt. There was disagreement whether it's a name of God or not, in which case we actually make a conditional statement that if it's a name of God, then we are sanctifying it. So all stam, stam is an acronym for what we're trained to write. So it's the short version is Safrut, the long version is Safrut stam. Stam stands for Sefer Torah, Tefillin, and Mezuzah. Also Megillah is in there too. It's all written on parchment, which is animal hide. Here's a piece of parchment sample. You know, it looks kind of white. It's not always white, and the back especially often it's spotted. I'm not going to go too much into the parchment because Shoshana will be speaking about that. But it has a different texture than paper does. It's made from a kosher species of animal. There are actually 2 types of parchment. There is cloth and there is gvil. Gvil is the full skin, and the cloth is kind of thinned out, and it's not the full layer of skin. I buy my cloth from a store in Israel. Not all of us are as amazing as Rabbi Linda Motzkin, who is on this call, who actually makes her own cloth, her own parchment. I will also mention that not every store will sell to women, but I buy from a store that does, and they're fully aware of who is doing the writing. Okay, so I write with a turkey feather. The feather does not come looking like a pen, of course. It's, you know, for the purpose of the turkey. So we have to cut the quill using various knives and blades. I'll show you this one. There's a razor blade. And basically the sides are cut. They're kind of cut in this curved shape. And in the center, there's a slit, which is the ink channel. If there's any surgeons in the room, by the way, this is a number 11. And this is a 15, which is one of the tools I use to correct mistakes if I need to scrape off one of the letters. Now, the most ancient writing tool is not a feather, but a reed, and some scribes still use a reed. They're both hollow in the middle, and one side is carved as a writing instrument. Okay, so the main principle when writing with a quill, I'm going to just demonstrate here, is that you're always pulling the ink, never pushing the ink. So even though I write Hebrew from right to left, meaning the script goes from right to left, I actually, you know what, I'm going to bring this closer. I actually do the strokes from left to right. If anyone can guess what I'm writing. You can put in the chat box. I hope it's not upside down. Would you tell me if it was upside down? Okay. Okay, so this says, says SVIVAH. And as you can see, the ink is pretty thick. It has a fairly high viscosity, and it sits atop the parchment in this very beautiful way. The ink used is typically a Gall ink made in part from gall nuts. Gall nuts are formed on certain trees when wasps lay eggs on that tree. Something like our reaction to a mosquito bite, like, you know, we get this like red bump, the tree gets these balls, like these balls form around it, and the wasp larvae are inside those balls. And once the adult wasp leaves, we actually take those gall nuts and crush them up, and that is part of how we make the ink. So cows are very large animals, however, not large enough to write an entire Sefer Torah on their skin. So what we do is we work in different pieces called yeriot, and then sew the pieces together using geed. I can go back a little. This is a spool of geed, which is animal sinew. And this is a tapestry needle. And we use the trusty awl. Where'd the awl go? Oh, well, I can't find it. Oh, there it is. And we actually poke holes in the edge of the yeriah and then sew the sheets together. And yes, if you're wondering if I was very nervous to poke holes in the very first time I was sewing a Torah, yes, I was very, very nervous to poke holes in the Torah. But you're of course not poking the holes in the letters, but still it was a little nerve-wracking. The same method is also used to sew the Torah onto the atzei chaim, or the staves, the wooden poles that Torahs, or many Torahs, are attached to. So let's see, in the final couple of minutes, there probably were questions. I said to put them in the chat and I totally forgot to look at the chat. But so a few other things that are helpful and that are in my office. I'm going to show you a few more. We have a soot sponge. A soot sponge is something I use on Torahs when I'm doing repair, and this is something I can kind of rub on the parchment and it gets the soot off, exactly what it sounds like. There are these little parchment band-aids that comes pre-stickied, and they help secure the seams together. But most of the time, if I'm doing a patch, well, all the time if I'm doing a patch, I will use glue and a piece of parchment. Let's say there was a hole in the Torah, I glue it a patch from behind and I can fix that hole. Let's see, there's the weighted sandbag, which is very useful because if you're repairing a Torah scroll, all that scroll wants to do is roll back up. So to keep it open, I put the sandbags, you know, on each side, and that is much easier to work on. And the last item I was going to show you actually somehow broke today. I looked at it and I was like, wait, it's not working. But it's a hydrometer, or it was a hydrometer, which tells me the humidity level in this room. In New York, it's more of a concern in the summer. The summer gets very humid, and that's a problem for the parchment. But I used to live in Mitz Paramon in the Negev desert of Israel. And there the problem was actually that it was too dry. The humidity levels were like 5-10% regularly. So probably the ideal for parchment is something like 40 to 60% humidity. And actually, there's one more tool. I don't fit in the toolbox, but the scribe is of course one of the tools that goes into writing stam, or writing the sacred writings, and I'm going to show you a picture of something that I think you might find interesting. So the first Torah that I wrote was for a museum. This is me on the right for the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco. This was 2009 through 2011. And they had an exhibit all about Torah and what goes into creating a Torah. And I sat in the museum and wrote a Torah, and people could watch. A couple years later, the Jewish Museum in Berlin did something similar, but they had a robot that wrote the Torah. Now, the museum acknowledged that the Torah that the robot wrote was not kosher. I mean, first of all, the robot did this in like 3 months. It took me a year and a half. But they said no, this is not a kosher Torah. And the reasons for this have to do halachically most with intention, kavanah. Remember how I talked about in the beginning, everything that's written has intention behind it. Especially around writing God's names with intention. Of course, a robot can't have intention, but I think there's also a feeling around a handwritten scroll that can't be replicated by a robot. They're all written by a particular person at a particular moment in time, and the scrolls carry that history. From what I understand, handwriting is actually even more individual than a fingerprint, which is, I think, a fascinating counterbalance to scrolls that contain, most of them, the same exact words and the same exact letters. Each scroll is absolutely unique, just as each human is unique. So that's the end of the scribe's toolbox.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was so fascinating. Just wanted to let everybody know that there is going to be a panel of the 3 sofrot at the end. So if you have your questions, hold on to them, and we can ask our questions later on. Also, to let you know, to give you a sense of our schedule tonight, we are going to have a little discussion now, and then we are going to hear from Rabbi Yonah about the history of women's involvement in being sofrot, and also then hear from Shoshana about her ethical parchment project. And then we'll go on and have the panel. Before we do that, Julie, we didn't even coordinate, although I did listen to your Eli talk. So I heard a little bit about what you spoke about at the end there, about how personal handwriting can be. And I think you spoke in your Eli talk about finding a recipe that was written maybe by your grandmother and by your mother, and how incredibly meaningful it was to you to see that handwriting. So right now, before we go on in our program, one of the things that we really believe in at HerTorah is that if you wanted to just hear something, you could put us on as a podcast and you could listen to us. But part of gathering means that we get to meet one another and talk to one another. So for the next 7 minutes, we are going to ask you to join a breakout room. And I know for some people, a breakout room is the cue to go to the bathroom and come back in 7 minutes. But I'm going to ask you to please, we're going to put you in groups of 5. And it's a really simple prompt. We're just going to ask you to say your name and where you're from in your group. And then if you'd like to share about a piece of handwritten text that's sacred to you. For instance, if you have a letter from somebody that you've been saving, all these years. Or I know recently I moved and I came across letters that my grandmother wrote to me, and it was so meaningful to me to see that. So along the lines of what Julie was talking about, the way that handwriting is so important, we're going to ask you, if you want to please share some thoughts about handwriting that's sacred to you. If despite all of my powers of persuasion, you still want to get your tea or your coffee, go ahead and come back in 7 minutes and we'll continue with the program. Okay, so please join your breakout room.
Welcome back, everybody.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your time with your group. I hope you met somebody new. The group that I was with was really wonderful, and it's incredible the kinds of stories that people have, and I just learned so much. So thank you to my group, and I hope everybody else also had a great experience speaking with their group or else getting themselves some tea. Okay, on to our next speaker. Rabbi Yonah Lavery-Yisraeli was born in Northern Ireland, grew up in Canada, and did most of her learning in Jerusalem at the conservative yeshiva Pardes and Matan. Her smicha is from Rab Elisha Anshulevitz. She works as a sofrot stam and is a faithful week-long minyaner at Beth Jacob Synagogue. Yes, right, because she's now in Hamilton, Ontario. She is honored to read Torah there sometimes and can do so in Moroccan and Ashkenazi nuschaot, but these days, primarily B'nai Israel nuschaot, Kuchini, and Old Baghdadi, which she was taught by Sister Abraham. Wow, I feel like we need a whole other HerTorah about that. Her Beit Midrash, Hamilton Beit Midrash, is so far the only place in Canada where Jews can study Talmud intensively, using traditional methodology and languages regardless of their gender. But hopefully it won't be the only one for too long. Rabbi Yonah is here. We're so excited that she's here. She's going to talk about a question that's come up a few times already in my conversations, which is the history of women being Torah scribes, sofrot. So Rabbi Yonah.
Hello. It's an honor to be here. I get the feeling my connection is maybe not so great, so let me know when that becomes a critical issue. I would like to start with a question. Maybe you can put the answer, your answer in the chat here. How long ago do you think it was that the first Jewish woman put on tefillin because she thought she had to? And perhaps because people in her community thought she had to. Rashi's daughters, yeah, that's a really common answer. Anybody want to suggest something other than that? 2000s? I don't know who Jay is, but Jay just messaged me sometime in the Talmud, and Jay is right on the money. I'll clarify something. I don't understand what you mean by had to. I mean, I think many people are at least somewhat on board with the idea that perhaps even if all genders aren't obligated in a mitzvah, perhaps they can still participate in a mitzvah. And that's not the question I'm asking. I'm talking about a person who has the understanding that they are obligated to, and they're not a man. With or without the bracha, if you think that you are obligated, you are using the bracha, right? If you're a rabbinic Jew. So yeah, I guess Michal Bat Shaul would be like an early example, but it's not clear what Michal thought of herself as doing. Did she think that she was commanded just like her father? Did she think that she was in a special category of people, perhaps because of growing up in a royal house? People who say Bruria, I think, are onto something as well. So first of all, I just want to note this wonderful pasuk in Kohelet that I think just does not get enough play. What we hear often from Kohelet is like, there's nothing new under the sun. But even more important that is, I think, there are some things that every time we see it, we say, oh, that's new, even though it's already been for so many iterations in history before us. And I think there's something about gender equality, gender de-emphasis, you know, like I almost want to say feminism, but I think it can come in so many more forms than maybe what we're used to politically when we think of feminism. That just chronically feels like it's something new, even when in fact it's echoing back to centuries before, or in this case, even millennia before. And I'd like to introduce some proof for you about that. But maybe first, I just want to speculate wildly. Maybe this has to do with the Western education system. Even for those of us who are educated, you know, at Jewish day schools, that sort of Western Christianized education has really had a big impact. And it looks back to a classical age of Greeks and Romans, and then kind of sees itself progressing from there, because there's nowhere really to go but up from ancient Greece in terms of gender equity. And we just weren't like that. I actually think that to contrast with Islam is interesting, because you actually do have some sense in Islamic scholars too that, wait a minute, maybe things are getting like worse, not better, right? And yeah, anyway, just a little something to keep in mind. So first source I want to send to you, actually, okay, I'll just show you on my little screen. Okay, is that we have two Tanaim who say that women and men are obligated in tefillin. Those are Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. So not exactly C-listers. In fact, these are maybe the two most prominent Tanaim in their generation, students of Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva himself had like some interesting things going on with gender and relationships between men and women in the way that he was looking at Torah. And here's just a little excerpt from it. It sneaks under the radar because the text is not overtly about tefillin. In fact, some of the juiciest texts, oh, I need to back up for a second. Why do tefillin matter? Sorry. Here you are thinking that you come to a little shiur about women and writing Sefer Torah, and I'm talking about tefillin. So traditionally, it's understood in halacha that some mitzvot come in a package, okay? You can't take one item out of the package, you buy the whole package, or just one item from within it. So you can be obligated in learning Torah, and with that comes writing Torah, and with that comes wearing tefillin, and also associated ones with that end up being things like writing mezuzot or just like writing ritual objects. So learning Torah and writing Torah and wearing tefillin are very, very deeply intertwined according to the traditional halachic understanding. And it's that way to this day. Why should that be? Well, it has to do with the way that we understood what tefillin were like back in the day. Nowadays, many people in many communities treat it as sort of like a prayer accessory that you put on for shacharit, for your morning prayers. But in earlier rabbinic times, people wore it. They wore it like jewelry. In fact, they compare it to jewelry. And a more substantial part of your day would be spent wearing tefillin, and that's clear from a number of stories in Talmud, and also how some communities continue to carry that mitzvah forward into the future. Tefillin is, in some ways, the ultimate symbol of freedom, and by freedom I don't mean not having a boss and being able to do what you want, because actually tefillin reduces the amount of things that you can do. You can't clean the cat box, for example. You can't go to the washroom. You can't laugh so hard you make yourself sick. You can't goof off when you're wearing tefillin. I think playing video games with tefillin is definitely asur. Unless it's like a really thinky, like puzzle video game where you're not giggling too much. So the association with tefillin and a kind of grown-up kind of freedom, the freedom of responsibility and being respected as an agent, a doer in your community, it's so strong that if you had a slave and you put tefillin on your slave, that's all that you have to do to liberate the slave. The slave is automatically liberated by the act of putting on tefillin. And when we see tefillin discussed with regards to gender in the Talmud, it's not actually discussed with regards to gender. It's discussed with regards to free people versus people who are not free. So anytime that they're discussing women versus men, they're actually discussing men versus women and slaves. And when the Talmud kind of brings up stories about people who were exceptional, you'll see it uses figures who were women and figures who were slaves rather interchangeably. So let me just go back, but not everybody held that opinion. So just going back to my little sheet here. Here's a little clip from Shabbat, but there's another very similar sugya in Eruvin. These are both tractates in the Talmud. And they're talking about what do you do when you find tefillin outside and it's Shabbat. And it's a problem because you can't carry them, but they're also tefillin lying out there in the open, and you don't love to leave them just like hanging out there. They could get damaged. It's just not a way of kavod. So here they say that the proper thing to do with them is etibeh abaye, But you can do is you can put on the tefillin and take them inside. And that way you're not carrying them, you're wearing them. And in this Breakout, you'll notice it says, it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. And just as part of the little deepen here, how they kind of go through this source, it just comes out. Rabbi Meir, who this is kind of like the interesting basis of his thing. He thinks that men and women are both obligated in wearing tefillin. He also has a couple other idiosyncratic ideas about wearing tefillin, like maybe you can put them on at night. And Rabbi Yehuda seems to think the same thing. This is in Eruvin 96b, where you see the same thing. And this is not just like a technical opinion, which they had. You actually can see it living and breathing in their communities. So it's just like this wonderful story from Yerushalmi Sotah, where and it's no coincidence you're seeing the same names pop up again and again, where Rabbi Meir used to teach drasha in the Beit Knesset of Hamata. Every Leilei Shuvah is like Friday night. And it talks about a woman who was a student who used to come. And one day the lecture went so late that by the time she got home, her husband was sitting at home and the candles had burned out. And he was sitting all alone in the dark, waiting for her to come back. He was like, well, where were you? This is Friday night dinner. And you seem to skip out. And she says, oh, I was going to the lecture at the Beit Knesset. And he is not impressed by this. He's very furious. And he says, that woman, when you speak to someone in third person in the Talmud, you know it's serious. That woman can't come back into my house until she's spat in the eye of that teacher. So in other words, he's kicking her out, and she's not allowed to come back until she spits in the eye of the inconsiderate teacher who kept her so long. So Rabbi Meir could see this with Ruach HaKodesh. I am fascinated by this term. I wonder, did she come to Shiur the next week looking a little rough? Did word get around town? Like, what does Ruach HaKodesh represent? It's representing some kind of, like, that wave of accurate intuition which we sometimes have about people. And he kind of gives himself an eye problem. This is his move to solve the issue. And then he goes around saying, if only there was a woman around here who knew how to do the thing where you spit in someone's eye to cure them of their eye problem. Does anybody here know how to do that? And the woman is kind of watching this being like, I don't want to do it. So she doesn't say anything because it's just so intense. Imagine your own teacher doing this to you, right? And so finally, he comes right up to her. He's like, do you know how to spit in someone's eye? And, like purely for medicinal purposes, like I really just, please, I got to get someone to spit in my eye. And she's like, oh no, I don't think so. Please. Okay, fine. So she spits in his eye. And he says, oh, the doctor said you got to do it 7 times. So she spits in his eye 7 times. And then he says to her, go and tell your husband, you told me to spit in his eye 1 time, but I spat in his eye 7 times. Now are you satisfied? So now the camera seems to zoom out a little bit, and we see that his students have been watching him, and they're a little aghast at this whole scene, and they say, Rabbi, can you disgrace the Torah this way? Here you are, a teacher of Torah, and you're getting people to spit in your eye, like, and 7 times. You can't even say that somebody asked for that or somebody needed that. And so he says to them, all right, should my honor be greater than the honor of God? And he makes a little association here between himself and the ritual of the Sotah. I don't even know how to translate Sotah into English. I'm not convinced that there's a great translation into English. But you know, the potentially adulterous woman in the Torah, that the husband is jealous of her, and he warns her not to be secluded with a certain person, and she seems to do so anyway. So he brings her to the Beit HaMikdash, or to the Mishkan back in the day, and the priest, the Kohen, writes out the name of God and dissolves it in water, and then she has to drink the water. And if she's fine, she's innocent. And if she's guilty, then she explodes. So here Rabbi Meir is saying God allows God's name, in fact commanded God's own name, to be written for the purpose of erasing it. That was written, the name of God that was written in holiness. Still God commanded that that name should be erased in the water, in order to bring peace between fighting partners. Shouldn't that be the same thing for me? Won't I allow my honor to be erased, you know, for the sake of bringing peace where there wasn't before? So many interesting things to notice about that story, including the things that the story doesn't think are interesting enough to point out or remarkable enough to point out. So notice she's learning Torah, her husband is not. Her husband is staying at home on Friday nights, and he seems to have made dinner. He certainly likes sitting there with the candles, you know, and the story doesn't remark on this. It's not like, hey, what a schmuck, why isn't he learning Torah or anything? The gender roles just like go down so easily. She is also, I didn't mention this or highlight this in the story, but she's actually supported by her fellow students. When the teachers see that Rabbi Meir was spat in his eye, they say, but we could have just beaten him up for you. That would have been a better solution. Like, let's just beat up the mean husband and everyone's happy. And Rabbi Meir is not very happy with that. With that solution. But you can see that she's not alone. She has fellowship. And it's also, of course, in the Hebrew, not clear either that she is the only woman. It seems to be a mixed gender Beit Midrash. And we see from other stories too, Beruria is teaching in this same community. She's a teacher of Torah in this community. And you can see her teaching male students as well as female students. So you really have this picture of, in some ways, an extremely modern seeming community of committed, observant Jews. And, you know, like, we think that we invented this in our generation and we're just now getting there. We might be just now getting somewhere, but it seems to me like we're just now coming around to that point in the wheel where gender relations are coming a little bit, they're approaching parity in some communities now. And, you know, perhaps again, the wheel will turn for less of that.
Rabbi Yonah, I'm just going to give you your 2-minute warning.
Okay, thank you. What can I say in 2 minutes? Well, I can't say already. I'll say that this is like what I'm giving here in this little presentation. It's not a pasak. It's a little window. It's a window onto what is possible when we're thinking about ourselves as being inheritors of a tradition. When we're thinking about lineage and we're thinking about sofrut or observance, that we don't need to feel like orphans. We don't need to feel like we are the newcomers into the story. In fact, we have ancestors, we have intellectual ancestors. There's a history of women writing Torah scrolls that goes back further probably than anyone can know. Jen Taylor has written about this and about uncovering more work by women in this field. But in general, like, that is only one aspect of a role of citizenship that a person can play. So, like, this is just like a little overview to give you that feeling. I have a wonderful source sheet here. If you would like to read it, you should get in touch with me. If you want to learn more about this, you should get in touch with me, because there's nothing that I would like better than to talk to you about it. If you want a little boost, in feeling that chizuk, feeling like that closeness with your heritage. And by heritage, I don't even necessarily mean DNA. I mean teaching. Please do. I'll just put my email here in the chat. And I'd love to hear from you. Maybe I'll hear some of your questions later.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Yonah. So far for each of the presentations, I've just been feeling like I wish we had an hour for each of you, but we will have a panel coming up at the end. So if you have questions, hold them, and we'll try to ask all our questions at the end. Our next sofrot is Shoshana Gugenheim Kedem, and she is going to be speaking about her ethical parchment project. Shoshana began her scribal training in Jerusalem in 2000 and the writing of her first Torah scroll in 2006. Shoshana approaches her scribal work as a social practice artist and curator. So you can ask her what she means by that. To this end, her scribing practice has included curating 2 collectively written scrolls created exclusively by women scribes, a community-wide Torah sewing event in Jerusalem, the creation of Women of the Book, an international visual midrash collection by Jewish women artists. And I would say for that, you can also get on her email list. I am now on her email list, and I get wonderful newsletters and art for the Parsha, for the Torah portion every week. And most recently, Or Chadash, a project that provides sustainably sourced parchment for Hebrew scribes. After 20 years in Israel, Shoshana now resides with her family in Portland, where she is the director of Art Lab, a fellowship for contemporary Jewish artists in the Portland area, and serves as the chief curator and artistic director of the Guggenheim Portland, situated in her family residence. And you can find her at her website. Shoshana, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. It's really an honor, and it's so fun to be with my colleagues, both who are speaking tonight and other colleagues who are here in this conversation. I'm going to share my screen. And look for my slides. Here we go. Okay, now I can't see anything. Okay, do you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. And let me move this. Okay. I want to be able to see some faces. Okay, good. I can see you, Ariella, so I feel like I'm talking to somebody. All right, I'm just going to start my timer. So I also just want to make a clarification about the word ethical versus sustainable versus higher animal welfare, because I actually use the term higher animal welfare parchment, and it's suggestive of us being on a spectrum of growth, that we can achieve more and more welfare in this process. And so I really want to share with you tonight about my work in thinking about parchment and parchment sourcing, less so parchment making, because I'm actually not a parchment maker. I'm thinking really about sanctity and kedusha and what makes an object sacred, which is a question that appears a lot of recent in my art practice. I primarily work as a contemporary artist, and a lot of my work intersects with my scribing practice. And if you had asked me in 2000 when I set out on this journey, even before then, when I was researching the ideas about women scribing, if I would end up where I am now, which is mostly dealing with thinking about parchment, I could have never imagined that, but that has been the arc. And so I just want to take us on a little journey. I want to let you know that there's going to be some graphic imagery here. And I want to share with you about the project that I'm working on right now, which is called Or Chadash, and we'll get there in a moment. So this question of what makes an object sacred is kind of at the heart of Or Chadash, of the work that I'm doing around parchment making. And I'm asking very specific questions. When is the moment that an object transitions from mundane to sacred? What is humans' agency and responsibility in that moment? Sorry. And are the appropriate intentions and invocations stated enough to deem an object sacred? So, and these questions really grow out of both the practice of scribing and the practice of making parchment, because it's the human intervention, right, that deems something as sacred. And that happens particularly, as Julie was talking about, in scribing, and then happens again at a certain moment in parchment making. And so, and we'll get to that. And so, so I'm asking this question about the sanctity, because perhaps, and this is what I'm looking at, perhaps it's not enough to just deem something sacred, that we really need to or should be looking at the whole arc of how this sacred object, and I think a lot about, when I say this sacred object, I'm thinking a lot about Torah. So just to back up for a moment and to understand more about how parchment is actually made. So as Julie mentioned, it comes from a kosher animal, primarily sheep, goat, cows, and sometimes deer. And we mentioned that Rabbi Linda Motzkin is here on this call, and she has a little appearance in this show, in this presentation. She is making parchment from deer skin and has been a really big inspiration to me in my work. So one of the things to understand is that there's so much to tell you. So one of the things to understand is that the parchment 99, just to be generous, I'll say that 99% of the parchment that is produced in the world comes from cows, and it specifically comes from the fetuses. It's fetal calfskin. Why? One, it's permitted. And two, it's very accessible because we primarily exist in the West, exist in a capitalist, consumerist culture that wants to produce everything as fast as it possibly can and in great quantities. And so if you're familiar with the with the industrial animal complex, that is the sourcing of the skins that we used, say, in the past 50 years to write any of our sacred texts on. Torah, Tfilim, Zuzot, Megillot, everything. And those fetal calf skins are coming from spent dairy cows who are raised in really horrific conditions, primarily in the United States, Argentina, and somewhat in New Zealand, but conditions are better in New Zealand. And that's to say that just recently, some of the parchment that's being made, and almost all of the parchment is made in Israel. And those are the three primary places from where it's sourced. Just to give you some images of what these cattle feedlots look like. Okay, this is where our sacred material is coming from for our sacred ritual objects. These are fetal calves that are extracted from the mothers, who are these spent dairy cows, and 23 to 30% of the dairy cows that go to slaughter every day are pregnant. and they take the calves out of them and then skin them and use that skin to make the parchment. In conversations that I've had, and I'm just looking at your face, Ariella, and I'm glad that I can't see everyone, but I forgot to warn you. I did say it was graphic, and it's also like a put on your seatbelt kind of situation. Like it's a lot. And I'll also say that there, in the 15 years that I've been thinking about this work and doing and writing about it and making, helping to get this parchment made, no, I've never spoken with anyone except for Linda, who has said, yeah, I really wonder where parchment comes from, or yeah, I can't believe that it comes from fetal calves in this condition. And I'll say also that I don't have a problem with skin being sourced from animals. I have a real problem with the way in which the industry brings those fetal calves to us. And so some of the languaging that I've heard some of the things that have been said to me in conversations with some of my parchment makers in Israel that I was working with was to say that, well, they've never been born, and so they haven't suffered. But I can't accept that as an excuse, because they like we are all part of this system. It's a system of exploitation of the workers, the animals, and the land. Okay, and so just to sort of, and that's a whole conversation in itself, and that is, I'll come back around to share how that's impactful in the work that I'm doing. So this is just to give you a little window. These are the parchment makers that I worked with for several years while I was living in Israel. And this is the Bach family's facility that we primarily buy our parchment from. The skins arrive in these huge containers. They're from these factory farms and slaughterhouses, and it's massive amounts. They're processed. You can see Avrami here is the facility manager. This is just a small snapshot of skins. Okay, thousands and thousands and thousands of skins, because that's what the industry can provide. Those fetal calves get thrown away. And the parchment making industry kind of just takes all of them and uses them for making parchment. So these are skins that are dried after they've been soaked. They're going to be re-wet and stretched. Then you can see some of that happening here. And then they go to the storefront. And again, like if you can compare that picture of Avrami standing in front of all those dried skins, and then this is after they've been fully processed, they're in the storefront, they're ready to be sold. And one of the things that happens, is that the industry itself that is providing these skins is based on excess. And so the animals' lives really don't matter. And there's always more. There's massive amounts of excess. And so these are fabulous parchment makers, but it doesn't really matter if not every piece is really great, because there's always more. And this was one of the obstacles that I was running into when I started making a parchment with them. These are the sons of the owner of Klaf Bach, and wonderful people who I've worked with for many years, who Julie also knows in Jerusalem. Okay, and so that leaves me, understanding the industry leaves me with this primary question of how does the Jewish community reconcile the par between the sanctity of our most holy texts and the inhumane treatment of the animals upon whose backs we are literally inscribing those texts. That
I heard something very interesting this Shabbos that really ties into this, when you have a minute. Here.
Sorry, I don't know who that was.
Kayla.
Okay, I'm going to keep going. So that's the primary question that is leading in for me. And I'm going to skip over this because I only have a couple minutes left. So I started working with this shochet, this ritual slaughterer in Israel. and who was living in the West Bank. And I started working with him, and he was providing me with skins from animals from backyard. He was our shochet that we were getting our meat from. And I started talking to him about what I wanted to do and asked him, can he get me skins? And he started bringing me skins, sometimes delivering them at 11 o'clock at night. And I would get up the next morning, I would freeze them, keep them in the freezer. And then at some point, take them to those parchment makers from Klaffbach, and they would make it into parchment for me. This is parchment. And I call it Or Chadash. It's a play on words. Or we hear the language of Or Chadash a lot, which is a new light, and Or with an Ayin is skin. So I'm playing with that phrase. And this says kevis, it says sheep. This was on the back of a Megillah that Julie wrote on the Or Chadash parchment that was made by the parchment makers in Israel. And these are some samples of on the right, Jen, Taylor Friedman wrote this mezuzah on the right. And this ketubah was written by another sister scribe of ours, Leanna Tapnak. This is actually just showing that there's precedence for thinking differently about parchment making. And this was some parchment making that we did with Rabbi Linda Motzkin when a bunch of many of the women scribes got together in Toronto when we were delivering a Torah, and other folks who are doing this kind of work. So it's out there. People are thinking about it. And so since I've left Israel and have been back in the States for the past almost 6 years, I have started shifting the making away from there and moving it here to the States. And there's several reasons for that. I'm not going to go into that right now, but you can read about that in my new publication about this work, which I'll share with you at the end. So this is Jacqueline Smith, who's the founding owner of Central Grazing Company in Kansas. And this is just a still from a film about her. She's an amazing shepherdess and artist, and she raises sheep and works with other sheep farmers who are raising at the highest level of certification for humanely raised or higher animal welfare shepherding and slaughter. And this is just another shot of her. And this is so she is positioned. I haven't actually started working with her yet in terms of her providing the skins, but we've been experimenting with different kinds of skin, sheepskin, goat skin, a little bit with deer skin, really trying to hone in on how you make the surface so that it's suitable for Hebrew scribes. And so this is Jessie Meyer, who is the owner of Pergamena, which is an amazing parchment making facility in upstate New York. And Julie lives very close to Jessie and was so wonderful as to go into his studio and test some of the parchment that Jessie and I were mailing back and forth to each other for almost a year, trying to find that correct surface. And this is just showing, like, we just sent back and forth. I sent him the quote unquote traditional parchment just to show him the surface. And he took different kinds of skins from other animals, really trying to get us to a place with sheepskin so that we can work with Jacqueline so that we can make the Or Chadash parchment here. And so this whole process is illustrated through images and a lot of writing. It's basically like a memoir and an expose on the parchment making industry. And this publication is just being released now. And here are just some images. And it's really an art journal that basically, or an art publication that really goes through this whole process and talks deeply about the industry and this intervention and why it's important and what it means in terms of regenerating land and people and animals and our commitment to Kedusha, to sanctity, and reshifting our orientation around sacred object that includes an all-embracing sense of sanctity, and what I'm saying is that no, it's not enough to state the invocation, the intention. Rather, we have to really think about how we're arriving to that moment and what the journey there looks like. And the other thing I'll say is that I worked with artist Matt Tanti, and we created, together, he did all the drawing. Conceptually, we worked together to create this sort of graphic narrative that tells the story of how the parchment is made right now, where it's sourced. It's always made in the same manner. It's the sourcing that I'm really getting at. And so this is how you can reach me. If you have any questions about parchment making, if you want to support it so we can really start making this Or Chadash parchment, if you're interested in any other publication material or educational material around this.
Wow, thank you so much, Shoshana. So much to think about. Really so much to think about from each of your presentations. And now I want to give people a chance to ask their questions. So I would ask you to please put your questions in the chat, and then we can ask the sofrot your questions. I know I have a lot of questions. So while we're waiting, I'm going to start with a question, a more general question for really all of you. I kind of want to know, what is the experience like sitting and writing a Torah, especially for so long? You know, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? And I guess part B of that question is, do you think it matters if a man is writing a Torah or a woman is writing a Torah? Is there any difference between those two experiences as far as you can think about? Who wants to start?
I'll start. First of all, I've unfortunately never had the experience of being a man as well as a woman, so I can't really.
I was gonna say the same thing.
Oh, we're so smart. But I don't think so. To me, it's just not important. I do think that people who either feel themselves to be approaching something fresh culturally, or they're made to feel like outsiders, can bring fresh insight. Like, for example, looking at something which is generally accepted and saying, wait a minute, this is not okay. That's just because Shoshana's presentation is so much in my mind. I feel that getting used to writing a Torah and getting used to being with a Sefer Torah is a lot like a baby. Before you have one, or before you work with a lot of babies, you're really scared they're going to break. And you're like, oh, what's going to happen? And everything seems like it's going to be like this incredibly high stakes, life or death moment. But after a while, you get used to what it's really like to be with a baby. That doesn't make it less special, but also the fear is not really there in the same way anymore. It's a feeling of, for me, the familiarity of love.
I'll add in a totally different direction that when I set out to write the first scroll that I was involved in writing, I went to a rabbi and Kabbalist that I knew, and I sat down with him, and I was like, okay, there were two different people that I spoke with, a man and a woman, at different times. And I asked him to help me understand this. I knew that there was something very important about women writing in this contemporary moment, for all of the reasons that I could conjure up and had confronted. But I wanted to know from him sort of what he thought and how he saw it. And one of the things that he said that really, I actually was reminded of it when you, Julie, were just talking about the handwriting being even more unique to a person than a fingerprint in terms of identifying people and whatnot. That he talked about the idea of what all of the meaning and all of the history that comes into that moment when that particular person or that particular group of people is sitting down to write a Torah scroll, and what happens when that scroll gets opened up, and what sort of energy is emitted out into the space and to the people that are confronted with it. So, that's kind of, I think about that a lot, the importance of people knowing the source of, at least, when a woman has written a scroll. I think it's still we're still in a time when it's important to know.
There are a couple of questions here about your training, when you knew that you wanted to be a sofrot, how you learned, what the process was like, if anybody wants to take that one.
I'll take that one. So I wanted to be a veterinarian, actually, when I was little. That did not happen. But I was, let's see, about 30, maybe in my early 30s, 30, 31. And I was living at a Jewish retreat center called Taylor Friedman in Northwest Connecticut. And I went on a short trip to Israel to visit for 10 days. And I was walking down the street and actually had a moment, like stopped in my tracks. And I just had the thought, I want to learn how to write the letters. I didn't even know it was called, I didn't know what it was called. I said, write the letters like they're written in the Torah. But this was not, I want to be a scribe or I want to write a Torah. I was not thinking in that direction, just kind of, I want to learn. And I had I lived in Israel many years. I chanted Torah even. I had a background in Jewish practice and etc. But I never thought about who wrote the sacred objects. And just all of a sudden I had this thought. And I came back home and I went to the art store and I bought a calligraphy pen. And I spent about 3 hours trying to figure out how to hold it. I had never done calligraphy, and I just looked around online for help or pictures I could follow to try and form the letters and start learning about the craft and how it was done and the rules. And a few months after practicing, I found Taylor Friedman, who has taught many of the sofrot, what we know, and she and I began meeting once a week in New York City, and I ended up also learning with several scribes in Jerusalem as well. A lot of it is learning the halacha, but also just practicing. I mean, sheets and sheets and sheets of practice and commitment to that. And I guess I'll add just to what is it like to write a Torah. Rabbi Yonah, I loved that comparison to the baby thing, because, some people say, wow, like you're writing Torah, are you just on a high all day long? It's like, well, no, which doesn't mean that I don't respect the Torah, doesn't, just because I'm not on a high, like as I'm writing the words, but it's, it's very focused and it's work and it's hard. Just like I imagine a baby is. I do not have one. But yeah, there's something about that intimacy, right? It's like the close relationships. It's not like the beginning, like the new person. It's like the deepening of that connection. So Jen and some other sofrim that I learned with, and a lot of practice.
Thank you so much. There's a question or two here about some questions about the laws when you're writing Torah, especially as a woman. Like, is there anything about menstruating and writing Torah? Or I think there's some ideas out there about menstruating women. So if you could address that.
I would love to address this rather neat. And I sense that you anticipate what the answer will be. No, this is a meme that needs to die. I don't know why people say it. Well, I do know why people say it, but it's it's really one of those made up things that kind of sounds old timey. You know, sort of like when I was saying there's some things that always feel new, there's some things that always feel old timey, and like menstrual taboos seem to be one of those things where you just say it and you're like, oh, that's probably right. There is a little bit of a culture of immersing in the mikvah before you write it that comes with like Hasidut, really, which is in the river of Judaism. That is one stream that you might be interested in, or you might not be. It also depends a lot on how you like your halakha. Do you like it to be based on texts? Do you like it to be based on the feeling tone of an experience? Or do you experience kedusha as like a sort of an emotional state? And if so, how do you get there? But in terms of actual halakha, what I would call from my, please understand this is coming from my own particular background, which is more text oriented, more text accountability based, is just made up.
Thank you so much. And I would add that if anyone's interested in this issue, I think Michal Lemberger has put out a pamphlet about it, where maybe through JOFA or one of those, another Jewish feminist organization that goes through all the sources and shows that it's more of a taboo, or maybe something coming from some Kabbalistic source that shouldn't hold sway.
I just want to say something else about that. It's also part of a patriarchal tradition that keeps Torah from women, and so it has been perpetuated. Whatever the source is, it has been perpetuated, I believe, also as a tool to keep distance.
Thank you. Any last words from our sofrot for now? I feel like we could be here all night. And I'm committed to getting everybody off of Zoom before 10 o'clock. So anything that you think that we really should take with us before we end our evening?
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
I'd love to just hear each of you, particularly because this is such a fascinating and takes such diligence and hard work in terms of it being an art form and a skill. Julie, you spoke a little bit about how the calling just hit you. Shoshana and Rabbi Yonah, I'd love for you to just also share, like, each one of you has some artistic side of you too. The idea of taking that artistic expression and channeling it into something that's spiritual, for me, is fascinating. So I'd love to hear you speak to that.
I can say, I can tell you exactly where it happened, exactly what year. In Jerusalem, in a morning minyan at Hebrew Union College, seeing the Torah scroll opened up and just like was completely overcome with this, not just desire, but like this, I have to do that. And it took many, 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 many years to sort of peel back all the layers of what that would mean and get through all the fear and anxiety and the not good enough stuff, all that stuff to actually sit down and do it. But for me, it was also like like a calling and a command. Yeah.
Wow, my experience was so different. I was writing my name in a book, sitting at yeshiva, like right before morning seder, before we started like our Gemara learning, and I had some new book. I was writing my name in it, and a teacher walked by and saw me, I suppose, taking care with my name, and thought, he said, you should really develop. There's what to develop here, and contact me after class, and I'll put you in touch with some people who can teach you sofrut. So it actually wasn't my idea. I did recently find this book again, and I was just so horrified how I wrote my name. I was like, oh, burn it, hide it. It's like a professional embarrassment to have a nun that looked like that. It was like basically a bet. It was not good. But I didn't know anything then, and now I know a little more.
Thank you so much. We're going to send out the information of your websites and the Sofrot website. There's a website that's has a collection of all the different sofrot so that you can get in touch with them. Thank you to Shoshana and Rabbi Yonah and to Julie for your wonderful presentations. So thought-provoking. I actually ordered a calligraphy pen, Julie, because you told me where to get it, and I'm excited to start playing around with it. I also want to thank all the other sofrot who came out to support this event tonight. Thank you. And I want to repeat my thanks to Bria Kahana, who met with me and helped me figure out how to connect with a sofrot and how to craft this evening. So thank you so much.